Well, madam, looking at this projection, you can see that big line contractors have done well over the years. Yes, this is the ground floor. You can see here we have offices for the nurses, and we have the emergency room here. And this is the emergency exit. And here we have the doctor's quarters here. Madam, thank you so much for making our time to see us. I believe this is going to be a great time.
You're welcome, sir. Absolutely. So thank you, sir. I've seen the hospital plan. But the bill of quantities is far too high. The cost is far too high for the government budget. And besides, we have to advertise it on paper. That's the procedure we have to follow. And we will select the proposal that reflects the best value for money.
Well, madam, that's not going to be a problem, actually. When you come to our office, we'll discuss that, okay? I'll see what we do. Thank you.
You're welcome, sir.
How are you, madam?
I'm okay, and you, sir?
I'm all right. Welcome to the Big Lion Contractors.
Thank you.
You can see this is my office.
It's beautiful.
Yes. Yes, actually, regarding the hospital plan, I believe that one is done and dusted. And for me to have you here, I believe we are going to get the contract. You see, mon ami, like here in Big Lion Contractors, we actually take care of our people. The World Cup is just around the corner. I believe you would like to see the World Cup. We'll take you to Brazil. One of the most beautiful homes in London. Anywhere of your choice. Open a bank account for you in Switzerland. Put in some millions. I can even make some donations to your political party. You will like it, believe me. Just give us this contract and all these things are going to be yours. Even your children, put them on scholarship. Just good things for you, man, believe me. You will like it. I will even take you to one of the big shops in Abu Dhabi, Dubai, get you some of these diamonds that's out there, golds and things. And a woman like those things. You get all of them. You know, just get these things the way we want it. Give you what you want.
You see, sir, what you're asking me to do is too difficult. Tenders are not being awarded by one person anymore. The procedure has changed. There's a whole committee that has to award the tender. Except you have to settle everybody on this committee.
Madam, ce n'est pas problem. Here in Big Lion, we believe in settlement.
Why do you think we have phases to this construction plan? I mean, we have it all sorted, madam. Phase 1 will take care of the tender committee. Phase 2 will even take care of the minister. But well, as for phase 3, we just dump this whole project and take care of ourselves. Isn't that what we're here for? All inclusive.
Like I said, madam, this is Big Lions and we behave like lions here. We're not antelopes. Just one. Open it up. See for yourself.
Interesting. Thank you so much, sir.
It's nice doing business with you, madam. I appreciate this.
Have a nice day.
Thank you so much.
And I'll get back to you.
All right.
Africa, arise. Let's fight corruption in our continent. In our continent. Africa, arise. Let's fight corruption in our continent. In our continent. Africa, Africa, hey. Say no to corruption, Africa. Africa, hey. Say no to corruption, Africa. Africa, hey. Say no to corruption, Africa. Africa, oh. Say no to corruption. Aye. We can live in a better place.
The private sector is a major player in Africa's economy and is crucial towards fostering long-term socio-economic growth, competitiveness, and development on the continent. From small businesses made up of 1 to 5 employees to medium-sized companies and large businesses, including multinational corporations, the private sector facilitates the flow of capital, goods, and services involving several billions of dollars annually. Article 1 of the African Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption defines the private sector as a sector of national economy under private ownership in which the allocation of productive resources is controlled by market forces rather than public authorities and other sectors of the economy not under the public sector or government. There is, however, a general concern that corruption impacts negatively on the enabling environment for private sector growth by hindering competitive business practices and increasing the cost of doing business. This is a huge problem globally, and Africa is no exception.
Corruption in the private sector, I think, is no more in any doubt, beginning. We used not to think that there's corruption in the private sector. It was always about public sector. Corruption has two sides, the giver and the taker. Oftentimes, the recipients of corruption oftentimes are the Western countries and Western actors and institutions. Money are lodged overseas, abroad. That tells you there's a two-leg way in the corruption process. It's a symmetrical process. And to that extent, even the corruption that takes place in Africa oftentimes have global dimensions. So it's a ring. It's a ring encapsulating all parts of the world, which we have to take as a global dimension of the African problem.
Although corruption is mainly attributed to public officials, the private sector is also a major perpetrator of corruption. In many instances, private businesses connive with public officials in various corrupt practices and fraudulent activities, which end up depriving ordinary citizens of proper service delivery and infrastructural development needed for sustainable growth. In other words, for corruption to grow, there has to be a demand and supply economy, a giver and a taker.
No, it's usually the private sector companies who actually pay the bribes to the other parties involved in that criminal relationship.
Apart from bribery, which is perhaps the most spoken about type of corruption, we're seeing different types of corruption in the global marketplace, many of which are also occurring in Africa. Firstly is this issue of facilitation payments, which involve the use of agents and intermediaries. Secondly, procurement malpractices is a big problem, and many a times these include bid rigging, fronting, and various other types of activities in order for companies to try and get an unfair advantage in tendering processes. Price fixing and other several types of anti-competitive practices is happening across the continent. And also we're seeing issues around money laundering, insider trading, and then there's this issue of outright fraud, theft, misrepresentation of information. Many times these are characterized by very low standards of transparency by businesses, and these have led to several corporate failures since the turn of the millennium.
I think that when you read the literature, you see huge sums of money that is being siphoned from the private sector. Those are the big types. As for conflict of interest, employing relatives, nepotism, ethnicism, and all of that are very rampant in the private sector.
I think it's very difficult to actually pinpoint an obvious manifestation of corruption. It's not always easy, especially when it comes to the private sector, because negotiations and deals are done through in closed doors.
One of the major challenges facing the continent at present is a massive scale of corruption that is being perpetrated by large multinational enterprises. Now, this is all around illicit financial flows, where multinational corporations and big conglomerates are using all types of innovative tactics to try and evade tax. They're using issues like transfer pricing and certain kinds of innovative accounting in terms of trading that is happening between subsidiaries of the same company.
So there is no proportional ratio, if you like, between what these multinational companies take out of Africa and what remains in Africa, and that is a major concern for AU Advisory Board on Corruption.
Now, according to research, the massive scale of illicit financial flows is perhaps costing the continent something like $50 billion annually. This is a lot of money that could have been otherwise have been used on the continent to support the actualization of the Millennium Development Goals.
We estimate that $1 trillion leaves developing countries every single year. That's a tremendous drain of capital, first and foremost. Even before you start talking about things like tax revenue and the uses of that tax revenue, $1 trillion every year is significantly more, in fact about 8 times more, than the amount of aid that flows into developing countries.
It is apparent that there is a general consensus on the cost of corruption to businesses. So why is corruption becoming pervasive in the private sector?
Firstly, there's a lot of pressure on businesses to show profitability, and a number of companies are trying to get an unfair advantage in the market, in the competitive global marketplace. Again, another issue is the quality of the tone that you have that is set at the quality of the tone that is set at the top by the leadership of the company or even the share owners. Many a times this is reflected in the type of key performance indicators and targets that are set for management. Often these relate mainly to the single bottom line, which is economic performance, irrespective of how that profit is created. And there's an absence of good corporate citizenship philosophies around social and environmental performance on the part of corporations. Now again, this can be encapsulated in the level of corporate governance, the quality of corporate governance practices within the corporation, in terms of the responsibility and transparency and accountability value chains across the corporation and its operations. Again, there's this issue of regulation, and in many of our African countries, regulation is weak, or the regulators have very little capacity in terms of enforcement. And oftentimes, businesses or business sectors are unable to self-regulate in the absence of appropriate regulation or in weak governance zones.
A fundamental challenge facing the fight against corruption in Africa relates to mainstreaming responsible business practices and ethical standards within the continent's indigenous corporations and informal forms of economic enterprises, particularly small businesses and cooperatives, which, while being survivalist in nature, require to be well governed and managed so as to attract investment, create wealth and employment.
Tackling corruption with the SMMEs, that has got to be done not only by officials or those who are in charge of businesses. It's got to be an effort by all, I mean from government side, from private sector side, and all the organizations.
The corruption is everywhere, but it depends the government how you tackle it. You see, because if the government wants to fight the corruption, first you have to start from the police department. If people are not having well educated about what to do, they'll always be corrupted.
Many stakeholders are increasingly demanding that the private sector should comply with relevant laws and conduct their activities in accordance with sound, ethical, accountable, and transparent business practices. This is seen as extremely important to help them to adapt to the fierce and unpredictable global financial markets, as well as provide them with better management systems, particularly as most businesses emerge from the impacts of the global recession.
The business ethics elements that can be mainstreamed for business owners in the fight against corruption, they actually include a whole lot of elements. There's the element of a good policy and legislative framework that they must implement and actually adhere to. That policy and legislative framework must have ethical leadership attached to it. It must have a strategy in place that follows a philosophy of sustainability principles, and those sustainability principles must always be underlined by values and ethical behavior.
Businesses worldwide need to be aware of what their obligations are. At the same time, they need to be aware of what their responsibilities are. I mean, that awareness then creates a situation where a company, for instance, is able to know, how do I fulfill that responsibility, or how do I fulfill that obligation?
In addition, there are increasing calls for collective multi-stakeholder action involving the public sector, the private sector, and civil society in order to tackle private sector corruption effectively.
The multi-stakeholder nature and the approach of collective action in the fight against corruption is actually a model that we're using right now in South Africa. And the basis of it is that, of course, companies or businesses can implement measures within their own operation areas to fight corruption. That is required, that is fundamentally important. That a business has systems in place, has processes in place, has mechanisms in place to be able to lower the risk within their own operation areas. But we say that corruption is transactional. So a company can do as much as it can to clean up its own immediate areas of operation. But because it is transactional, what that means is that the risk can lie elsewhere. It can lie in the supply chain, it could be in another company that you do business with. The risk could be in another sector that you transact with. And that is why it's really important that when we talk about corruption, especially on tangible steps or on concrete steps, collective action becomes very important because corruption does not sit in one place.
The Business Action Against Corruption, also known as the BAAC, is an African private sector-led initiative aimed at combating corruption on the continent. The BAAC initiative was founded on the view that corruption can only be tackled if cooperative alliances are built through collaboration with businesses, government, and civil society.
Well, the program that we're looking at on the Business Action Against Corruption, what we identified is that in most of these economies, corruption is a big issue. But people don't really have the tools to try and address that. Sometimes you have private sector saying, well, we wouldn't want to pay corruption. But what are some of the ethical questions and the dilemmas that they're facing? So the Business Action Against Corruption was set up as a tool, as a collective platform that private sector would look at establishing standards that would help them to address all these issues that they would face and set up their own policies. Because in most cases, some of the companies, you can decide not to pay a bribe, but would that then in a way negatively impact your competitive base? So what we wanted to look at is that, seeing that there is no first mover advantage in fighting corruption, why don't we get a collective where as a unit private sector can say, we're not going to be paying bribes, we're not going to be oiling pockets of politicians or government officials for us to get a contract.
In Principle 10 of its provisions requires that businesses should work against corruption in all its forms, including extortion and bribery.
The Global Compact 10th principle states that businesses should work against corruption in all its forms. The 10th principle is one of the risk areas that we experience in South Africa. Basically, what the Global Compact focuses is on the role of business in being active corporate citizens, and then that is now structured in, across 10 different principles, one of them being the fight against corruption. So the main question there is that what is the role of business in fighting corruption, and so forms the 10th principle of the Global Compact.
There is a saying that when you fight corruption, corruption fights back. The question then is, as regulators, what should the public sector be doing to ensure that the private sector operates in a responsible manner?
Okay, the role of the public sector is basically to implement and ensure that the legislative framework with regards to anti-corruption is implemented, and part of the regulator's job is to ensure that it is done effectively. So they need to go in and have regular visits. They have to ensure that larger companies, and indeed all businesses, actually do what is expected of them.
We need to make policy guidelines clear on how the multinational corporations should behave in Africa. So far they behave freely without strong regulatory regime.
I think that one of the things is to empower both civil society and investigative institutions to be able to combat and investigate corruption in the private sector. In Ghana, it used to be that the Commission on Human Rights, which is constitutionally mandated to fight corruption, we don't have the mandate to investigate a private person. But that in 2011 was clarified. We were investigating a private person and he challenged our authority and mandate. So we went to the Supreme Court for interpretation. And the Supreme Court said that if SRAJ were to draw such artificial boundaries about a private person and then the public person in corruption, then it would have been a dereliction of duty. So it clarified that when you are investigating a public officer and the private person is part of it, you don't stop it.
The African Union Advisory Board on Corruption, as part of their broader mandate, is tasked with the responsibility of ensuring that African countries sign, ratify, and implement the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption. As part of its requirements, Chapter 11 of the African Union Convention stipulates that state parties must firstly adopt legislative and other measures to prevent and combat acts of corruption and related offences committed in and by agents of the private sector. Secondly, establish mechanisms to encourage participation by the private sector in the fight against unfair competition, respect of the tender procedures, and property rights. And thirdly, adopt such other measures as may be necessary to prevent companies from paying bribes to win tenders.
I'm very grateful to having had the opportunity to come to visit the minister here, which is in charge of the fight against corruption. We were pleased to exchange some view with the minister, and he promised us that as Cameroon has already signed the convention at the African Union Convention against corruption, there will be soon a move to start the process of its ratification. We want to welcome Cameroon in the family of the Pan-African family of the fighting against corruption, and we know that there is a political will which has been demonstrated by Cameroon, and we want that other countries, in Africa, share the experiences, the good experiences which has been expressed in this country, and the leadership the minister have shown in this domain. Thank you.
The African Union Advisory Board on Corruption is the focal point for the African Economic and Corporate Governance Subcluster, which provides a platform for joint planning and programming with a view to developing a common strategy for closer coordination and synergy of the cluster's capacity building initiatives in support of the African Union organs, institutions, and programs.
Le Conseil de l'Union africaine, chargé de la prévention et de la lutte contre la corruption, est prêt à aider les États qui le souhaitent à mettre à leur disposition l'assistance nécessaire pour les aider à mettre en place des dispositions et les rendre fonctionnelles pour améliorer la lutte contre la corruption sur notre continent.
Dans la corruption, dans la corruption, Africa dans la corruption, à la corruption, pauvreté accentuée, famine, conséquences maladie, à cause de la corruption.
Riche continent, dépourvu d'évolution due à la mauvaise gouvernance politique et financière, nos richesses volées, une éducation corrompue qui promouvoit la voyoucratie sénile dans les rues d'Afrique. Lève-toi Afrique, et bats-toi contre la corruption qui détruit les mœurs et ton avenir.